Plainfield, Wisconsin, in the early 1950s, was the kind of small Midwestern town that could vanish from the map and few beyond the county line would notice. The population barely broke 700. Wooden storefronts lined the single main street, a hardware store, a diner, a feed shop, a bar. Everyone knew everyone else, or at least thought they did. The rhythm of life was simple: sunrise, chores, supper, sleep. On weekends, the townsfolk gathered at the tavern or church socials. In summer, kids ran barefoot through the fields. In winter, they shoveled snow until their hands went numb. It was not the kind of place anyone expected to make headlines, let alone the kind that would later give birth to the darkest legends of American horror. Among the familiar faces was Ed Gein, a shy, soft-spoken handyman who kept mostly to himself. He lived alone on a 160-acre farm a few miles outside town, a property that locals called the Gein Place. His father had died years earlier, his brother was gone too, and his mother, a stern, pious woman named Augusta, had passed away not long before. Ed was awkward but polite. He did odd jobs for neighbors, fixing fences, babysitting kids, patching roofs. He was the sort of man who seemed harmless, even a little pitiful. Mothers let their children help him in the yard. Shopkeepers trusted him on credit. When people spoke of him, it was usually with a shrug and a sympathetic smile. Poor Eddie. Never was quite right after his mom died. What no one knew was that behind the weather-beaten walls of that farmhouse, something monstrous was taking shape. The winter of 1957 came early. Snow drifted over the narrow country roads, and the people of Plainfield busied themselves preparing for the cold months ahead. At Hogan's Tavern, the owner, Bernice Wardens, kept the stove burning hot and the coffee strong for hunters coming in from the fields. November 16, 1957, began like any other day in Plainfield. Hunters trudged through the woods. Children skated on frozen ponds. No one imagined that, within hours, their quiet town would become a national headline, and that the name Ed Gein would soon become synonymous with madness, mutilation, and horror. No monster is born in a single night. They are shaped, carved slowly by loneliness, fear, and the hands of those who raise them. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, a small, rural place hemmed in by farmland and silence. His parents, George and Augusta Gein, were already an ill-fitted pair. George was a heavy drinker, often jobless, angry at life and everyone in it. Augusta was the opposite, severe, righteous, and fanatically religious. To her, the world outside their home was wicked and damned. She preached that women were instruments of sin, that sex was evil, and that men who gave in to lust were doomed to hellfire. Her voice was the law in the Gein household, and her son Ed absorbed every word like scripture. From his earliest years, Ed lived under her shadow. He adored her, feared her, and built his identity around her approval. When other children played baseball or went to church picnics, Ed was at home, reading the Bible aloud while Augusta ranted about the sins of mankind. The world is full of filth, she told him. And only the righteous will be spared. When the family moved to Plainfield, Wisconsin, around 1915, Augusta saw it as an act of divine providence. The 160-acre farm they bought was remote, surrounded by woods, no neighbors in sight. That isolation suited her. She rarely allowed her sons, Ed and Henry, to leave the property except for school. Even there, Ed was different. He was small, quiet, and awkward, with a strange, vacant smile. His classmates teased him, and his teachers noted that he would sometimes laugh to himself, not cruelly, but as if hearing a joke only he could understand. Home was no refuge. Augusta's tirades grew harsher, and George's drinking worsened. Fights often ended with smashed bottles and bruised silence. Through it all, Ed learned to retreat into his imagination. He devoured adventure stories and pulp magazines, fascinated by tales of death and power, things forbidden in his mother's eyes. In a way, he became a student of both sin and salvation. In 1940, George Gein died from heart failure, leaving the two brothers and their mother alone on the farm. Henry and Ed worked odd jobs around town to keep things running, mostly carpentry and handyman work. But cracks were beginning to form. Henry, the older brother, started questioning Augusta's authority. He worried about Ed's attachment to her, calling it unnatural. He'd tell friends that Ed talked about her like she was holy. Then, in May 1944, a fire broke out while the brothers were burning brush on the property. When firefighters arrived, the blaze was out, but Henry was dead. Ed claimed he'd lost sight of his brother during the fire and found him face down later, accidentally. The official cause of death was asphyxiation, though some noticed bruises on Henry's head. No one investigated further. After that day, Ed Gein was truly alone, with only his mother left, the woman who had shaped his world and twisted it beyond repair. Augusta suffered a series of strokes soon after Henry's death. Ed cared for her like a devoted servant, cooking, cleaning, and sitting by her bed, listening as she read scripture aloud. She grew weaker, but her control never faded. Even bedridden, she lectured him on the evils of women, the corruption of the flesh, and the dangers of sin. In December 1945, Augusta Gein died. To the people of Plainfield, it was a sad but unremarkable loss, just another old woman passing on in the winter. But to Ed, it was the end of the world. Neighbors noticed a change in him. He stopped shaving. His voice grew quieter, his eyes emptier. The farmhouse began to decay, dust gathering in every corner. He locked his mother's bedroom and never entered it again. Yet, in some part of his mind, she never left. After Augusta's death, the Gein farm became a tomb. And Ed Gein, its keeper. For most of Plainfield, the Gein farmhouse looked deserted. Paint peeled, shingles loosened, and the barn doors hung crooked. Inside, the rooms were dim and cold. Ed boarded up his mother's bedroom and the parlor, sealing them as shrines, untouched. He lived in two small rooms, the kitchen and a back corner littered with newspapers, tools, and pulp magazines. On his walls hung clippings about crime, anatomy, and disasters. Neighbors described him as odd but harmless. He came into town for groceries or to trade farm produce, always polite, sometimes with a far-off look in his eyes. He still did repair work, occasionally babysat local children, and attended a few community events. But those who visited his farm noticed a heavy smell, and strange items lying around, old bones, tanning tools, medical books. Few asked questions. Eddie was just Eddie, one local later said. You didn't expect anything bad from him, just loneliness. As years passed, his isolation thickened. He began reading medical journals and tabloid stories about grave robbers, anatomy, and strange cults. He spent long winter nights wandering cemeteries, claiming he felt close to his mother there. Somewhere in those lonely hours, grief and delusion blurred. He began to believe he could somehow bring Augusta back, or at least keep her presence alive. This obsession became the center of his world. He scavenged for objects that reminded him of her, studied how bodies were prepared, and collected things he thought might help him understand death. Psychologists later called it a grief psychosis fed by religious guilt and sexual repression. At the time, Plainfield saw only a quiet man slipping further into himself. Throughout the early 1950s, a few women in surrounding towns disappeared. One was tavern owner Mary Hogan in 1954, her bar closed overnight, and blood was found on the floor. Locals whispered, but there were no leads. When asked, Ed would smile faintly and say, "She's not missing, she's just at my place." People laughed it off as one of his strange jokes. November 16, 1957. The day Plainfield's quiet ended. That morning, Bernice Wardens opened her hardware store as usual. She was known in town for her kindness and sharp business sense. Around midday, Ed Gein stopped in to buy antifreeze. She wrote his name on the last sales slip of the day. By evening, her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Wardens, found the store empty, the cash register open, and blood on the floor. A single receipt, Gaines, lay on the counter. Police drove the 10 miles out to the Gein farm. The barn was dark, the house locked. Snow was falling. They pried open a side door and stepped inside with flashlights. The smell hit first, rot, oil, and decay. The beam of a flashlight swept across cluttered walls, boxes, tools, and objects that at first seemed like old hunting trophies. Then realization set in, these were not from animals. In the barn, hanging from the rafters, they found the missing woman. Inside the house, dozens of human remains and bizarre household items made from body parts were discovered. Ed Gein had been robbing graves for years and using what he found to make furniture, clothing, and keepsakes. The officers stepped outside into the freezing night, silent and shaken. One vomited in the snow. The sheriff radioed for backup, his voice breaking. By dawn, Plainfield was swarmed with reporters. What they found inside would soon horrify the world. Gein was found later that evening at a neighbor's house. When police confronted him, he didn't resist. In the interrogation room, he spoke in a calm, almost gentle voice. He admitted to taking bodies from graves, claiming he needed materials, and that he often didn't remember what he had done. He spoke of his mother as if she were still alive, guiding him. He described putting on her skin to feel closer to her, an act that investigators and psychiatrists later interpreted as an extreme attempt to become the woman he idolized and feared. "I loved her too much," he said quietly. "And too much love can do strange things." The court declared him mentally unfit for trial. He was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he would spend the rest of his life. Plainfield never recovered. The farmhouse was burned down by locals months later, whether by accident or design, no one was certain. Only ashes and twisted metal remained. By the time the truth came out, the people of Plainfield no longer recognized their own reflection. The man they once pitied had become a mirror of everything they feared. After his arrest in 1957, Ed Gein's name filled every newspaper in America. Journalists crowded the small county courthouse, writing headlines that read like horror fiction. But the legal process was slow, clouded by questions of insanity, competence, and justice. Doctors at Central State Hospital for the criminally insane evaluated him for months. They diagnosed schizophrenia with psychotic features, citing his detachment from reality, grave-robbing impulses, and delusional connection to his deceased mother. Gein told psychiatrists he often entered trances, and could not remember his actions afterward. He admitted to robbing graves, at least 9, maybe more, but insisted he only took what he needed. The remains found on his farm matched several missing women in the region, but only 2 killings could be firmly attributed to him, Mary Hogan and Bernice Wardens. In January 1958, a judge ruled him legally insane and unfit for trial. Instead of prison, he was committed indefinitely to a psychiatric institution, a sterile place of linoleum floors, buzzing lights, and echoing corridors. Central State was a world apart from Plainfield. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and faint despair. Ed Gein became patient 228, assigned to a small, windowed room. Staff described him as quiet, polite, even helpful. He spent hours reading, drawing, and doing simple maintenance tasks. He rarely spoke of his crimes. When questioned, he claimed not to remember or brushed off details with eerie calm. Once, when asked how he felt about the women he exhumed, he said softly, "They looked like Mama." Psychiatrists documented his condition as severe dissociative psychosis, a mind fractured between guilt, delusion, and devotion. One doctor wrote, "He is not driven by hatred or rage, but by longing, the need to fill an impossible emptiness." To the staff, he was the model patient. To the outside world, he was the face of evil. In 1968, after a decade of treatment, Gein was declared competent to stand trial. By then, public fascination with his case had turned morbid. Curious visitors drove to Plainfield to see the ashes of his farm, collecting bricks or rusted tools as souvenirs. His trial lasted only a week. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict unsurprising: guilty, but legally insane. He was returned to Central State Hospital, where he would live out the rest of his life under medical supervision. Reporters noted that he showed no anger, fear, or remorse, only mild confusion. When asked if he thought he deserved punishment, he said, "They already burned my house down. That's enough." He remained there until July 26, 1984, when he died of respiratory failure at age 77. His body was buried in Plainfield Cemetery beside his mother, beneath an unmarked patch of earth after souvenir hunters chipped away his gravestone. If Ed Gein's crimes had been forgotten, the world might have moved on. But his story burrowed deep into American culture. Writers, filmmakers, and psychologists dissected him endlessly, a man who blurred the line between human and monster. Robert Bloch, a novelist living just miles from Plainfield, used Gein as the inspiration for Norman Bates in his 1959 novel Psycho. In the 1970s, the Texas Chain Saw Massacre drew from Gein's grotesque trophies and isolation. Later, The Silence of the Lambs would echo his psychology in the chilling character of Buffalo Bill. Each story distorted him further, turning the quiet handyman of Plainfield into a mythic figure, part cautionary tale, part cultural ghost. But behind every version, the truth remained the same. A lonely man, broken by grief and raised in fear, tried to build love out of death. And in doing so, he showed the world that horror doesn't live only in monsters, it can grow, quietly, in the heart of an ordinary neighbor. Time covers things over like Wisconsin snow, but underneath, nothing truly disappears. When the reporters and detectives finally left, Plainfield was a town trying to forget. The burned foundation of the Gein farmhouse became an empty field, the locals avoided driving past it after dark. Children were warned never to wander near the property line. The townspeople who had known Ed, who'd bought eggs from him, hired him for odd jobs, or shared coffee at the diner, rarely spoke his name again. For them, the horror wasn't only in what he did, but in how ordinary he had seemed. The small cemetery on the edge of town became a quiet place of uneasy pilgrimage. Tourists came to stare at the ground that hid his grave, locals came only when they had to, eyes down, hurrying back to their cars. While Plainfield tried to erase him, the wider world couldn't look away. Every decade seemed to rediscover Ed Gein, in film, literature, or psychology lectures. He became the skeleton key to America's obsession with the killer next door. Authors and screenwriters stripped away his name but kept the essence: the lonely man, the domineering mother, the house full of secrets. Psycho turned him into Norman Bates. The Texas Chain Saw Massacre transformed him into Leatherface. Silence of the Lambs borrowed his grotesque craftsmanship. Each retelling was another mask, fictional, exaggerated, yet behind them all was the same truth: Ed Gein was real, and he had once walked through a small town's grocery aisle like anyone else. For criminologists and psychiatrists, the case became a landmark. It showed how isolation, religious fanaticism, and repressed desire could warp a fragile mind. It also forced American law enforcement to begin studying psychological profiling, an idea still new in the 1950s. Before Gein, murderers were seen as criminals. After him, investigators began to see them as patterns of behavior, rooted in trauma and obsession. His case became a grim textbook example in hospitals and universities, not to sensationalize, but to understand. Today, the Gein farm is gone. Wild grass covers the foundations, only fragments of rusted machinery remain. The wind over the field sounds the same as it did a century ago. Visitors still drive down the gravel road, sometimes stopping, stepping out, and staring into the emptiness. There's nothing to see, yet something about that emptiness makes people uneasy. In town, older residents still remember the day the sheriff's sirens broke the silence of 1957. Younger ones hear it as legend. And every winter, when snow falls thick across Waushara County, the landscape looks just as it did on that morning when the police first walked into the barn. The story ends where it began, in a quiet, ordinary place that taught the world what horror can hide behind a neighbor's door.